Ready? Welcome back to the Corona Shutdown AP review for AP Environmental Science. Uh, Hopefully this video finds you healthy, well, and in good spirits too, because good spirits is an important part. We have to keep from getting depressed and bummed out, which is really easy to do when you're not allowed hanging out with your friends and interacting with each other. Uh, Set up some Zoom meetings, FaceTime. Uh, get out, walk the dogs, go for a walk in your neighborhood. All that stuff is great at minimizing your uh, uh, depression. So when we're looking at this next unit, it's going to be Unit 2, which is about the living world, focusing on biodiversity. So when we look at it, one of the big things that people messed up on the Padlet free response question was it asked for two different scales to measure biodiversity. And everybody immediately jumped to the species richness and species evenness. That's not a scale to measure biodiversity. That's ways to quantify how much biodiversity is there, but it's not going to tell you what the biodiversity type is. When we look at the types of biodiversity, we're looking at genetic, which is going to be the different traits in a population. It's the reason why we look different than each other. I said in class, if you remember, I'm devastatingly handsome. You guys are all not as handsome as I am. That's what we're talking about with genetic diversity. It's the reason why my Cocker Spaniel looks different than another Cocker Spaniel. Even if they look like they're twins, there's still slight variations and slight differences within them. That's the genetic diversity part. When we talk about species diversity, this is what everybody usually jumps to when thinking about biodiversity. This is the different organisms in an ecosystem. I should say different types of organisms. And on that Padlet free response, you guys probably would have gotten 1 out of the 2 points because species richness is a measure of the species diversity. It's a way to break species diversity down to quantify how much biodiversity is present. It looks at the richness value and then the evenness value as well. But that's not going to help you out with like habitat diversity or genetic diversity since they're all the same species. The only time that you break biodiversity down into the richness and evenness part is when you're talking about species diversity only. When we look at habitat diversity, this is the different habitats in an ecosystem. So, whenever I look at my backyard, I have a garden in my backyard. So that's a specific habitat. Terrestrial organisms can live there. But next to my garden, I have rain barrels to collect the rainwater that I can use to water my garden. That would be an aquatic habitat because there's bacteria, there's different larvae of insects living in there, all those different things. So these would be the different habitats in an area. I have a stream down over the hill from my house. That's going to be another different habitat. The woods near my house versus the grass that I have in my lawn. All those different things are going to lead to habitat diversity. So why is this so important to us? When we're looking at diversity, it's all about long-term stability. The more variety you have, the more stable an ecosystem can be. Just think about like eating dinner. The more variety of food your folks provide for you, the more happy you're going to be. So, if you're eating hot dogs every single day, day in, day out, you're going to get sick of hot dogs and just absolutely hate them. But if you have hot dogs one day and then salad the next day and hamburgers, and then you have a steak and some chicken and a bunch of different variety, your meals are going to be more enjoyable and you're going to enjoy that interaction much more. That's going to give you long-term stability in terms of what you're eating. So when we look in terms of ecosystems, now we're looking at more diversity, better chances of long-term survival. Because what happens is as the ecosystem changes, if you have more biodiversity present, the ecosystem is going to change and put stresses on that ecosystem. The more diversity you have within it, the more likely something's going to be there that can survive that change. So the more biodiversity, the better there is for a population to survive long term, whether we're talking about genetic diversity or species diversity. So when we look at genetic diversity, everybody has different genes for a reason, not just so we look different. Everybody has these different genes. I don't want to say they have them for a reason. They just happen to have different genes. So let's say that the ecosystem changes and the Cocker Spaniels that are black and white versus the Cocker Spaniels that are brown and white. If the ecosystem would change and become more of a wooded area where there's a lot more trees and brown colorations. The browner Cocker Spaniels are going to be better suited for surviving than the black ones. If my population was all black Cocker Spaniels, now I don't have that ability to adapt to that changed environment. So, the ones that are black and white, they're going to have a lower chance of survival, and they're going to end up dying off, and the population can eventually go extinct. The other thing we want to look at is the higher the richness value. The richness is going to be our variety of different species. The more different species we have present, the quicker the ecosystem is going to recover. Because if I have an ecosystem that has a bunch of different species in it, let's say we have, all of these different colors are representing a different species. If something comes through and wipes out the majority of the population, I'm going to have a higher richness value. So some of these are going to be able to survive that change. If I have some of them surviving that change, now that ecosystem is going to recover a lot quicker. Populations are going to reestablish. We're going to have food sources available. Organisms are going to start coming back much quicker. If I have all yellow organisms, a very low richness value, again, remember, richness is how many different species we have present in an area. If I have just one species and low richness, now that entire species gets wiped out, it's just a barren landscape now. It's not going to be able to recover from that. So the more richness you have, the easier it is to recover from that disruption. The more genetic diversity you have, the better chance you have for long-term survival, because different genes are going to be present to provide for evolution and adaptation to changes. Now, when we look at habitat diversity, we want to have habitat diversity because when you start talking about loss of habitats, that's going to impact the species greatly. Again, we talked about how richness is going to help them have stability. We talked about how genetic diversity is going to help them have stability. But when we lose our habitat altogether, say that the water dried up in the stream behind my house, that habitat's completely gone. When we look at that changing, it's always going to affect the ecosystems in a fairly predictable pattern. The first ones to go extinct are going to be our specialist species. Go ahead, take a second, pause the video, see if you can remember what a specialist species is. All right, hopefully when you guys paused it, hopefully you came back and said, all right, I know that specialist species require very specific conditions. And they need those specific conditions to survive, whether it's a fish needing a certain pH of water, or a terrestrial organism needing a specific type of background camouflage. There's specialist species that live in the rainforest that only live on one trunk of one tree only. If you take them away from that tree, they end up dying off because they're specifically adapted to that tree. So they require very specific conditions. They only survive a very narrow range of changes to those conditions. If we lose our habitat completely, the stream dries up behind my house, those specialist species are the first ones to go because they don't have the food source they need. They don't have the conditions that they need to survive anymore, and they start dying off. After the specialists are gone, though, the generalist species still survive. So take a second, pause the video again, see if you can define what a generalist species is. Great. Hopefully you guys came back to us and you're saying that a generalist species is the opposite of a specialist. It doesn't require specific conditions. It can survive a wide range of conditions. So now let's say that we have a frog or a toad or a snake that lives in that stream down over the hill from my house. So that let's say it's a snake. That snake needs the water because it needs a water source to drink, but it's not completely dependent on that water. It can slither into a new area. As long as there's a water source nearby, it can still survive. That's more of a generalist species. It likes to have the water present, but it doesn't absolutely need that to survive. It can survive drier conditions, it can survive wetter conditions, but it has that ability to survive through a range of conditions. The more specialized a species is, the higher its risk of extinction. The more generalized the species is, the lesser the chance for extinction, because again, it has the ability, I don't want to say adapt because it's not changing its behavior or changing its genetics. It just simply goes and lives in a different area, or it shifts from eating one thing to eating another thing. So the more generalized you are, the more likely you are to survive that abrupt change in the ecosystem. So the other thing that impacts this is those species with large territorial requirements. Go ahead, pause it again, see if you can come up with a couple species that would have large territorial requirements. All right. Some examples might be elephants. You could have tigers. You could have, oh gosh, what would be another one? Sharks, whales. Those are all things that have huge amount of territory they need to survive. In order to support an elephant, you might need 4,000 acres of land. To support a tiger, they might need 5 or 6 square miles of land. Even a whale, whales migrate for thousands of miles every year. So they have major, major territorial requirements. As we lose those habitats, their habitat is going from being that huge, maybe 5 square miles of space. And as we start developing for human development, building up cities, we start increasing our agricultural land. We start to infringe on that territory. Now it goes down to maybe 3 miles squared. And then we infringe on it even more, and it goes down to maybe 1 mile squared. Now we took it from where it had the big territory of the 5 miles squared, took it down to 1 mile squared, and now those organisms aren't able to survive in that 1 square mile. There's too much competition for resources. So what happens is some of those organisms are going to start to die off. If we shrink the ecosystem down too much or the habitat down too much, now the entire population goes extinct. Now, this I can foresee being a huge part of the AP exam this year, since they're looking at environmental problems and changes we're causing and ways to fix them. Ecosystem services lend themselves to that type of question perfectly. Ecosystem services are what the ecosystems are going to do for us. And there's a few different types. We have provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and supporting services. This last one of supporting services, think about this matching up and supplementing all the other types. I know when we were talking about this in class this year, there was a lot of confusion between supporting services and regulating services. Supporting services are going to help these others function. So that's an easier way to think about it. These are the big three. The supporting ones kind of go along with those. So we break them down into their groups. And again, this is on that 2020 AP Environmental Exam cheat sheet that I posted on Google Classroom. I strongly, strongly encourage you guys to print that out and keep that beside you on the test day. That way it gives you a nice, easy chart to look at if they start asking questions about these. So when we look at provisioning services, those are going to be the tangible things that the ecosystems provide us. So when we look at it, it's either going to be materials or energy outputs from an ecosystem. So we get things like food, the provisioning service of the food, that's going to give us that habitat or the growing conditions needed. We're going to grow fruits and vegetables. We get a lot of foods from the wilderness. If you drink energy drinks, ginseng comes from forested areas. If you like truffles on your purgatory fries, the truffle fries they have, truffles again grow in forests. They don't grow on farms. So we have a lot of those foods that come from the wild, but we can also have managed agroecosystems, which are basically just a fancy word for farms. So farms are part of those provisioning services. Farms are still an ecosystem. We have forest, we have marine and freshwater systems, all those things that provide us our food. The food production is that provisioning service it gives us. We also get our raw materials. Those are going to be our construction and fuel sources. So construction things would be like, wood for building materials, all those different things. Fuel would be like our biofuels, fuel wood that we're using in our fireplaces to heat our homes. In the less economically developed world, the biomass fuel that they're using to heat and cook with, whether it's animal dung or whether it's wood. The other big one is freshwater. We don't think about freshwater being a big thing because we turn on our taps and the freshwater comes out of it. But if you're not living in that type of means that you can turn on the tap at your house and the fresh water comes out, fresh water is a big, big problem for a lot of the less economically developed countries. They have to sometimes walk 1 mile to 2 miles to get to the community well to be able to pump fresh water, carry it back to their house because they don't have indoor plumbing. So fresh water is provided by those ecosystems through that hydrologic cycle. They allow the hydrologic cycle to function where we have the heat being absorbed by the water, causing it to evaporate. As the heat energy leaves, it condenses down. That condensation forms our clouds. As enough moisture builds up in them, then we have the precipitation falling. As it precipitates down, that's where that fresh water is coming from. Sorry, Milo, saying hello to everybody. The other thing we have are medicines. At one time, I'm not sure whether this is still the statistic, but almost 80% of all cancer drugs came from the rainforest. So our forested areas and our plants and animals provide us with a huge amount of medicine. Even if it's not necessarily the chemical directly used in the medicine, a lot of times the delivery system for that chemical is derived from plants. They see how the chemicals travel through the plants or how the chemicals are synthesized within the plants. Then they bring that back and make it into a synthetic version back in the lab setting. So those are our provisioning services. The second one are our regulating services. These are some of the most important, and I'm guessing on the AP exam, this is what they would probably turn to. Because if they're looking for environmental problems and how humans are affecting the planet, we're drastically impacting these regulating services. So we have climate, local climate, and air quality. These are going to be things like pollution going up in the sky affecting the air quality. The regulating services that the ecosystems provide, when we look at local climate and air quality, the air quality is going to be improved by natural filtration of the air. Some of the plants are going to take in some of the pollutants that are out there. They're going to absorb carbon dioxide into them. They're going to store different toxins that might have gotten out into the environment within their tissues. But we also have our local climate being affected by it. If you live in an area with a lot of vegetation, it tends to be cooler than an area without vegetation. If you live in a desert, that's going to provide massive temperature fluctuations between day and night. Really, really hot in the daytime, really cold in the nighttime, because there's no moisture in the soil to hold that heat in. If you're nearby a lake, you tend to have a microclimate created because that lake absorbs heat and holds onto it readily. So even though at nighttime the outdoor temperature should be 40 or 50 degrees, if the water that you're beside is in the 70s and 80s, you're going to be a lot higher of a temperature than what the countryside without that lake nearby is going to be. We have moderation of extreme events. As we start seeing climate change occurring, we're seeing more and more major storms. So if we have great functioning ecosystems or high functioning ecosystems, we don't see as many of those massive tornadoes and massive hurricanes because we are getting that climate regulation. We are getting the normal conditions that we should expect as opposed to those major extreme conditions. And then when we look at also with this moderation of extreme events, think about a massive hurricane coming in, and that massive hurricane is going to push a storm surge inland. If you have functioning wetlands nearby, those wetlands are going to help to absorb that excess water to reduce the flooding. We also end up with coral reefs, for instance. They're going to regulate the wave action nearby. They're not going to allow those waves to impact the shoreline or coastal habitats as much because they're going to help slow those waves down. They help to break them apart. Mangrove forests, they do the same thing. Those roots, those tangled up roots everywhere, those are going to help to slow the water down moving inland. We get wastewater treatment. Again, as the water flows down through the ground, it's naturally filtered because, again, as the porosity of the ground allows the water to penetrate and flow through, some of the toxins then get attached to the clay particles or to the sand and silt particles, and they end up adhering to them, and they don't end up going into our drinking water then. So all those are going to be provided by the ecosystem. I don't think I really have to go through these other ones. I think you can understand this. The carbon sequestration and storage, this is going to be that photosynthetic process. So it's going to absorb carbon dioxide in. It's going to change that carbon from the carbon dioxide into tissues of the plant. That tissue of the plant then is going to store that carbon long term. If we're talking about a tree, some of those trees can last 400, 500, 600 years. Most of them are going to last in that 50 to 100-year range. So as they're absorbing that carbon in, it's being stored within their tissues for extensive amounts of time. Now, cultural services, those are the easiest ones. These are going to be the ones you can't touch, you can't measure, you can't quantify. These are the ones that it's just kind of giving you that feeling type of thing. So it could be inspiration. A writer has writer block. So he goes out and takes a walk in the woods and all of a sudden an idea pops into his head. It could be educational. We start to educate people on the importance of the rainforest because it has a high biodiversity level. So if we actually have functional, intact ecosystems, we can take education groups there, study them, and gain benefit from those. Recreation's a giant one. On the AP exam, if they ask you for anything like this, jump the recreation because recreation is the easiest one. If it's asking for, what are some services provided by forests, you can jump straight to recreation. People enjoy taking walks in the woods. They're gaining benefit from doing that. They're gaining enjoyment from doing that. Aesthetic value, it's pretty to look at. So, you can jump to that one as well. So unless they're asking for a very specific type of service, I would jump to the recreation and aesthetic. You can link recreation to economics as well. So you can say, all right, people are paying money to come in for ecotourism. They want to go for a boat ride on the ocean. So they're going to pay money to come and rent a boat. They're going to pay dock fees. They're going to pay things like that. So they're going to use that recreation. The local communities are using that recreation ecosystem service to provide a financial stability in their area. Now, the last one, supporting services, again, these go back to help all those other ones function. When we talked about the provisioning services, wood production, and all those things, soil formation is going to be a big part of that. So we need functioning, healthy soil. So that soil formation process with the decomposition and Milo, stop. When the soil formation has, decomposition happening and the organic materials breaking down to provide structure for the soil, that's going to be one of those supporting services. Another supporting service is biodiversity. Again, link it back to what we talked about. More biodiverse an area, the more stable the ecosystem. Primary productivity, again, that's the rate at which sunlight is converted into chemical usable energy. And I think we're going to stop this video here, and we'll get into the second part of Unit 2 in our next video. So thanks for watching, guys. I'll be right back with your second one.